Welcome to a space where hearts speak and emotions breathe. Here, every story is raw, real, and unfiltered, a journey through moments that awaken what we thought was lost. Imagine a quiet evening where tears fall unnoticed, and suddenly someone arrives, a presence so gentle it sparks long, forgotten warmth and desire. Picture a connection that defies age, expectation, and fear, blending longing with tender urgency, where forbidden attraction feels irresistible yet profound. Feel the rediscovery of passion, where subtle touches, lingering glances, and whispered words reignite the soul, making every heartbeat a testament to desire and love. And experience transformation, where heartbreak gives way to deep emotional fulfillment. Intimacy blends with soulful connection, and wounds thought permanent are healed by the quiet power of being truly seen. This is a world of love, awakening, and emotional intensity, told as if it's your heart speaking directly. It was one of those evenings that felt heavier than the last, the kind where the quiet in the house presses against every corner of the heart. Sitting on the edge of the sofa, hands trembling slightly, the tears came without warning, falling faster than could be caught. It wasn't just sadness. It was years of loneliness, the weight of disappointment, the quiet despair that comes when life seems to have quietly forgotten you. No one could see this side. No one was supposed to. Vulnerability had always been a private, dangerous thing, and yet here it was, spilling out like a river that had no choice but to find its way. And then, unexpectedly, someone appeared. Not in a grand or dramatic way, but softly, almost hesitantly, like stepping into a room filled with a fragile echo of silence. Their presence wasn't loud, it wasn't intrusive, it was simply there, grounding. There was a pause, a hesitation, as if they were trying to measure the right distance, the proper way to step into a space so raw, so exposed. But somehow, the eyes that met mine had a warmth that immediately disarmed every defensive layer, every wall carefully built over decades. There was no judgment, no rushed attempt to fix anything, just recognition, the kind that sinks deep into the soul and makes it ache in the most unexpectedly comforting way. A hand reached out and it didn't startle. It was gentle, careful, a bridge offered without a demand. It was a touch that spoke of safety, that whispered, without words, that it was okay to feel, to let it all out. There was an understanding in the way the fingers lingered, just enough to remind that connection exists even when it feels impossible. That warmth, that small, deliberate gesture, stirred something long dormant, a memory of being seen, truly seen, without pretense or expectation. It was electric and soft all at once. Conversation didn't begin immediately. Sometimes words are too clumsy for moments like these, and silence carries more honesty. They simply stayed, close enough to be present, far enough to respect the unspoken need for space. And in that quiet, it became impossible to deny the pull, the deep acknowledgement that this encounter was not ordinary. Every sigh, every quiet intake of breath felt like it was mirrored by theirs, a rhythm syncing in a way that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the heart. It wasn't about charm or grand gestures. It was the attention, the meticulous care in noticing the small tremor in the hands, the catch in the voice, the way the shoulders slumped under invisible weight. Someone noticing the unspoken, holding it gently instead of recoiling, opened a space inside that had been locked tight for years. And in that space, emotions long buried began to stir, hope, longing, a flicker of something that hadn't been allowed to breathe in a very long time. Eyes met again, holding just a fraction longer than polite attention would dictate, and suddenly the world outside seemed irrelevant. The ache of past regrets, the shadows of lost opportunities, they all faded slightly in the glow of being acknowledged so deeply. Tears continued, unrestrained and still. They stayed, hand resting softly, a steady presence anchoring the storm within. Each touch, subtle and unassuming, became a declaration that vulnerability could be met with care instead of indifference, that emotion could be welcomed instead of silenced. There was a strange intimacy in the silence, an understanding that didn't require explanation. It was as if the soul had been waiting for a voice it hadn't yet recognized, a quiet permission to feel everything fully without fear. Every shiver of emotion, every tremor of suppressed desire was met with an almost sacred attention, a reverence that made it impossible not to lean into it. The comfort was intoxicating, stirring memories of passion and tenderness that life had tried to bury under layers of routine and disappointment. And then came the first words, soft, tentative, but so real it felt like hearing a song you'd forgotten you loved. They didn't ask for stories or explanations. They simply acknowledged the moment, validated the feeling, made space for it to exist without reservation. It was astonishing how something so simple, so unassuming, could feel like the turning point of a lifetime. Every ache of the heart felt lighter, every fear slightly less imposing, every shadow of doubt brushed away by the gravity of being seen. It wasn't about rushing, about leaps into the unknown. It was the subtle, deliberate gestures, the way a hand lingered near, the quiet attention to small cues, the patient understanding of unspoken needs, that became a language more compelling than words ever could be. There was a recognition that desire and emotion could coexist without judgment, that passion could rise from tenderness, that deep connection often begins in silence and careful attention. By the time the first night settled in fully, it wasn't about anything as simple as attraction or curiosity. It was about the rare, almost miraculous acknowledgement that someone could witness the fragility, the heartbreak, the unguarded soul, and respond not with dismissal, but with profound care. That realization was intoxicating, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. It sparked a fire that had been smoldering unnoticed, a longing not just for touch, but for understanding, for belonging, for the deep thrill of being truly recognized. Even now, recalling that moment brings a shiver, a warmth, a swell of emotion that is almost impossible to articulate. It was the night when walls began to crumble, when vulnerability was no longer a liability but a bridge, when the heart remembered what it felt like to be alive in the presence of someone who could meet it fully, with courage, patience, and care. And though the world outside continued to turn with all its indifference, inside that small shared space, a spark had been ignited, one that promised not just desire, but a love so deep and unguarded that it could change everything. And in that moment, it became clear that everything before had been preparation for this. The long years of solitude, the quiet despair, the heartbreak, all leading to a single, breathtaking understanding that connection like this was possible, even when it seemed impossible. And just like that, a heart thought lost forever found a reason to hope again. It was impossible to ignore the pull that had grown between us, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet insistent in a way that made every glance and every brush of hands feel charged with something forbidden and thrilling. There was a rhythm to it, a tension that hummed beneath the surface, quietly daring the heart to notice what the mind tried to deny. It wasn't simply attraction. It was more, something that reached past appearances, past age, past the usual rules that had always guided life with a careful hand. Every conversation carried a weight, a resonance that lingered long after words had been spoken. Sitting across from him, the world felt simultaneously larger and smaller. Larger because suddenly every possibility seemed open, every secret longing imaginable awakened by the mere awareness of his nearness. Smaller because in that tiny, charged space, it felt as if no one else existed, as if the universe had contracted to hold just the two of us in a moment that was both delicate and dangerously intoxicating. There was a danger in it, yes, an unspoken understanding that others would judge, that whispers and disapproval lurked nearby, but the thrill of defiance only made the emotions more urgent, more magnetic. It wasn't about recklessness, not truly. It was about recognition, the realization that two souls could find each other despite everything society would call impossible. There was an immediacy in every glance, a heat in every smile that seemed to linger just a fraction longer than it should. It was intoxicating, a drug that had no name, and yet its effects were unmistakable. A quickened heartbeat, a shiver down the spine, an ache of longing that seemed to fill every empty space left by years of solitude. Every moment together became an unspoken negotiation of boundaries, a dance that was as tender as it was electrifying. When he reached for a hand or brushed a strand of hair from the face, it felt like an avalanche of feeling, unexpected, undeniable, and utterly consuming. There was an intimacy that required no words, no promises, only the acknowledgement that what existed between us was raw, urgent, and impossible to ignore. It made the world outside seem distant, trivial even, compared to the storm building quietly within the heart. And yet, the awareness of our difference in years always lingered at the edges, a shadow that made every touch and every word feel daring. It wasn't about youth versus age. It was about what had been denied, what had been lost, what had been waiting to awaken. In him, there was curiosity and admiration that felt untainted, an openness that had been absent in the world for far too long. In myself, there was a recognition of desire, of passion, of longing that had been suppressed under the weight of time and responsibility. Together, it became something dangerously magnetic, impossible to resist, impossible to ignore. There were moments when the air between us trembled with unspoken words, the kind that could never be fully voiced without shattering the fragile, thrilling tension. A glance, a smile, a near touch, each became a confession in its own way. The longing was forbidden not only by age, but by the unspoken rules that had always governed the world. And yet the very act of acknowledging it, of surrendering to the emotion rather than denying it, made it feel like the truest, most authentic connection either of us had ever known. It was a different kind of love, one that didn't follow scripts or polite expectations. It was raw and urgent, but it was also profoundly intimate. The closeness wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a deep resonance that bypassed logic and demanded recognition. There was something almost sacred about the way he seemed to see everything at once. The ache of loneliness, the desire for connection, the hunger for a touch that carried meaning beyond mere pleasure. And in response, the heart could not help but lean in, tremble, and give itself over, even when fear whispered warnings about the impossible path ahead. Every encounter became a study in restraint and surrender. The moments were fleeting yet monumental, a hand lingering just a little too long, a brush of fingers that sent heat spiraling through the veins, a shared silence that was heavier than words. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, the kind of connection that forces the soul to confront its own capacity for desire and devotion. Each interaction left an indelible mark, a memory seared into the heart that could not be erased, no matter how the world insisted it should be impossible. The forbidden nature of it made every touch more meaningful, every smile more profound. There was an urgency that pulsed beneath the surface, a recognition that these moments were fleeting yet eternal, that the intensity of feeling was matched only by its fragility. It was a dance along the edge of propriety and temptation, and the thrill came not from rebellion alone, but from the depth of emotion that could be shared in a space that felt untouched by judgment. At times, the mind struggled to reconcile the danger with the yearning. The heart wanted to plunge headfirst into what it recognized as extraordinary, while logic reminded of the outside world, of the rules, of the whispers, and the assumptions waiting to pounce. But in his presence, the tension eased, replaced by a profound certainty that what existed between us was real, undeniable, and worth every risk. It was a connection that refused to be defined by convention, one that demanded honesty, courage, and a willingness to embrace the forbidden without apology. In the quiet aftermath of each encounter, there was always a lingering heat, a memory of proximity that refused to fade. The longing stretched into the spaces between thoughts, coloring dreams and shaping desires. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and yet impossible to fully articulate. It was a love that transcended the ordinary, a magnetic force that drew the heart forward, even when the world whispered caution. And in the end, it became clear that the intensity, the danger, the undeniable attraction was not just about desire. It was about recognition, about being truly seen and understood in a way that had been absent for far too long. The connection wasn't measured in years or appearances, but in the depth of feeling and the courage it took to embrace what the heart demanded. And just like that, every hesitation, every whispered warning, every shadow of doubt fell away, leaving only the undeniable truth. This was a love that defied expectation, a bond that burned brighter because it dared to be forbidden. It started with the smallest things, gestures so subtle they could have been mistaken for coincidence. Yet each one carried a weight that set the heart pounding. A brush of fingers along the arm as he passed by, a lingering glance that held longer than politeness allowed, a quiet word spoken just for the ear it was meant for. At first, it felt like nothing more than attention, but slowly, impossibly, it grew into something that set every nerve on fire, awakening a part of the soul that had been silent for far too long. There was a hesitancy in it, a caution born of years that had taught to protect, to hide, to keep desire tucked safely away. And yet, there was no mistaking the electricity that danced in the air when he was near. It wasn't about rushing or forcing something that wasn't ready. It was about noticing, feeling, acknowledging what had always been alive beneath the surface, waiting patiently for a spark to ignite it. And when the spark came, it did so gently at first, a teasing warmth in the chest, a flutter of anticipation in the stomach, a whisper of curiosity that demanded attention. Every touch became an exploration, a language that spoke louder than words could ever manage. When fingers brushed across a hand or a shoulder, it wasn't just skin meeting skin, it was recognition, understanding, a connection that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the heart. There was a thrill in the simplicity, an intimacy in restraint, and a profound sweetness in the slow, deliberate unfolding of desire. It was a rediscovery not of someone new, but of what had been quietly waiting within, waiting for permission to be felt again. And it wasn't just physical, though the body responded with a truth that could not be denied. It was emotional too, the way a glance could say without speaking that someone understood the ache, the longing, the hunger for connection that had gone unspoken for decades. It was in the way the presence lingered, how the attention never felt intrusive but always reassuring. Desire grew alongside trust, intimacy alongside affection, and passion alongside the unspoken acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening, something fragile, something intoxicating. The journey wasn't sudden, nor was it chaotic. It was measured, patient, unfolding like a slow bloom in the heart. Moments of closeness built gradually, each one layering upon the last until it became impossible to separate emotion from longing, tenderness from desire, heart from body. When he leaned closer, when a hand found its way to mine without question, when laughter softened into quiet conversation late into the night, it all carried the weight of awakening. It was as if every nerve, every memory, Every shadow of old desire had been waiting for this exact series of touches and glances to pull it into the light. There was a vulnerability in it, of course, because surrendering to desire after so long is frightening. Every heartbeat carried both fear and exhilaration, each smile both hope and hesitation. But the very act of allowing it to exist, of leaning into the subtle, whispered communication of need and longing, became liberating. It was no longer about hiding, no longer about shame. It was about acknowledgement, acceptance, and the courage to feel fully again. Words became secondary to the language of closeness. A brush of a hand across the back, a gentle tightening of fingers, a pause in movement that allowed a gaze to linger longer than it should. All of these became declarations of feeling that were deeper than any spoken confession. Desire didn't need to be named, only felt, experienced, let grow organically, and it did, in ways that left no part of the heart untouched. Every sigh, every shiver, every quickened breath became a rhythm, a song that only the two of us could hear, resonating with the long, forgotten pulse of passion that had been lying dormant. Even simple moments became charged with meaning. Sitting together in silence, a foot brushing against another, a hand resting lightly against a knee, the warmth of proximity, it all created a tension that was both subtle and undeniable. It wasn't reckless or forced, it was exquisite in its patience, exquisite in its restraint, and exquisite in the way it allowed desire to coexist with profound love. Each small movement was an invitation, a question, a confession of need that didn't require answering in words because the heart already knew. The emotional intimacy deepened alongside the awakening of passion. Each glance held a question, each smile a promise, each subtle touch a bridge between longing and fulfillment. The connection became something that could not be denied or ignored, a magnetic pull that drew the soul closer even as the mind warned of caution. And yet the warnings were drowned out by the certainty of the sensation, the certainty that what was unfolding was both real and rare, a rediscovery not just of desire, but of vitality, of self, of the capacity to feel again in ways that were profound and unrestrained. It was remarkable how quickly the body and heart remembered their own language when met with patience and care. Every subtle touch, every whispered word, every fleeting contact became a teacher, reminding that passion is not merely physical. It is a conversation between souls, a dialogue of longing and acknowledgement, a meeting point of desire and tenderness. And with every heartbeat, every gentle closeness, it became impossible to deny the depth of what was happening, impossible to resist the call of both the body and the heart. By the time the evening would fade into night, it wasn't just about longing or fleeting desire anymore. It was about recognition, about honoring the parts of the self that had been dormant, about understanding that intimacy is as much about emotional resonance as it is about physical closeness. The passion that blossomed was not reckless, it was not hurried, it was deliberate, sacred, a rediscovery of what it meant to be fully alive, fully felt, and fully seen. In the quiet aftermath, when the warmth of closeness lingered and the heart was still thrumming from the intensity of being both wanted and understood, it became clear that this rediscovery was transformative. It was a reclamation of self, of desire, of life itself. Through subtle touches, lingering glances, and whispered words, it became impossible not to feel the full breadth of what was possible, the intertwining of passion and profound love, the reclamation of the heart, and the awakening of a desire that had been waiting patiently all along. And in that moment, it became undeniable that the heart had been waiting for this, and that it was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. It didn't happen all at once. Transformation rarely does. It crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the heart began to recognize the change that had taken root. The weight of years, the loneliness, the disappointments, the quiet despair had been heavy, pressing against every moment of life, leaving no space for hope. And yet, in the midst of the unexpected, something shifted, something that reshaped everything from the inside out. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word became a thread weaving a new pattern, one that was softer, warmer, and infinitely more alive than anything that had existed before. The physical closeness was a catalyst, yes, but it was the emotional intimacy that truly transformed. Each gentle brush of a hand, each lingering embrace, was not just about desire. It was a mirror reflecting back worth, beauty, and the capacity to feel deeply again. It was astonishing how quickly walls that had been built over decades could crumble in the presence of someone who saw not just the exterior, but the heart, the soul, the places that had been bruised and abandoned. With every touch, the ache of heartbreak began to ease, replaced by a warmth that spread slowly, insistently, until it reached every corner that had long been cold. The conversations became as intimate as the physical contact. Words were chosen carefully, often whispered, carrying a gravity and tenderness that could heal in ways silence could not. When confessions of longing, fear, and vulnerability were met not with judgment but with understanding, the heart began to open in ways that felt impossible until that moment. Every revelation, every shared secret, was a step toward reclaiming a self that had been dulled by years of solitude. And in the presence of that attention, that care, it became clear that intimacy was not just about closeness. It was about recognition, acknowledgement, and the courage to feel fully. There were moments that felt suspended in time, where the world outside ceased to exist, and it was just the two of us, hearts beating in quiet rhythm, souls acknowledging each other in a profound, unspoken conversation. The hands that intertwined, the gentle pressure of a palm against the back, the careful tracing of fingers along a shoulder, they all became statements of trust, of devotion, of a love that was at once tender and consuming. In those moments, heartbreak felt distant, almost impossible to remember, replaced by a sensation of being truly known and wholly accepted. It was transformative because it was unexpected. There had been no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, only the quiet persistence of presence, attention, and care. And yet, the impact was undeniable. The heart, once shuttered against pain, began to breathe again. The soul, once weary of longing, began to expand in ways that were frightening and exhilarating all at once. Even the body responded, recognizing the authenticity of touch and emotion, remembering sensations thought long forgotten. Desire became a language of love rather than a fleeting impulse, a way of connecting that was as much about soul as it was about flesh. The most remarkable part was that the change was not forced, it was earned. Each moment of closeness was a choice, a mutual willingness to meet at the crossroads of longing and trust. Nothing rushed, nothing coerced, yet the effect was profound. The ache that had defined so many years was replaced by an awareness of what it meant to be alive, to be seen, to be desired, and to be loved in a way that encompassed the entirety of being. Every lingering gaze, every whispered word, every heartbeat in sync became proof that the heart could recover, that wounds thought permanent could heal when met with the right touch, the right presence, the right love. Even the quiet, mundane moments carried the weight of transformation. Sitting side by side, sharing laughter that felt effortless, holding hands in moments of unspoken solidarity, stealing glances across a room that spoke volumes, all of it was imbued with a tenderness that the heart recognized instantly. Each ordinary act became extraordinary because it was charged with intention, with care, with an understanding that love was not always loud or flashy, but it was undeniable when real, and yet the transformation was not merely about happiness or comfort. It was also about courage, the courage to let go of the past, to shed the armor built over decades, to allow vulnerability to exist alongside strength. Every heartbeat, every gentle caress, every word spoken in quiet reverence demanded an openness that was both terrifying and liberating. In that openness there was freedom, the freedom to love, to desire, to feel, to be fully present in every moment without fear of judgment or rejection. There were nights when the physical intimacy was quiet, almost tentative, yet it carried more weight than any dramatic encounter could. A hand resting lightly against a thigh, a shoulder brushing against another, a forehead pressed briefly to a cheek. Each act became a bridge between heartbreak and fulfillment, between solitude and connection. The warmth of a body close enough to feel without needing to speak conveyed everything the heart could not yet find words for. And with each encounter, no matter how small, the transformation deepened, leaving a mark that was invisible to the world but indelible within the soul. It was a love that healed not through grandiose gestures but through consistent presence. Every smile that lingered, every laugh shared, every moment of quiet understanding became a stitch in a tapestry of renewal. The heart began to trust again, the body responded with recognition, and the soul remembered what it felt like to be cherished fully, without reservation. The past no longer defined the present. The wounds that had seemed permanent became threads woven into a narrative of resilience, longing, and ultimately, profound love. And as the days turned into nights, and the nights back into days, it became impossible to deny the truth. That connection could arrive unexpectedly at any moment, with the power to transform everything it touched. What had begun as subtle gestures, lingering glances, and whispered words had grown into something unshakable, something that blended passion with emotional depth, desire with profound intimacy. The heart once closed off now beat with a confidence born of being truly seen, truly understood, and truly loved, and in that realization the world shifted. The emptiness that had seemed permanent melted into memory, replaced by a warmth that spread into every corner of being. Every fear, every doubt, every ache was transformed into a quiet knowledge that love, in its most authentic form, could heal, elevate, and awaken in ways that nothing else ever could. And in the stillness of one quiet evening, when the warmth lingered and the heart knew it had found a home it never expected, it became clear that this transformation was not just a moment, it was a lifetime in the making. Thank you for sharing this journey with me, for feeling every heartbeat, every longing, and every moment of transformation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe, because more raw, emotional, and unforgettable stories of love and awakening are coming your way. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment where passion meets soul, where hearts reconnect, and where love transforms in ways you never imagined.